Well, thank you for being here. I hope you get a chance to check out the show upstairs if you haven't already. Before discussing the work on view here, 217, I would like to start off with a bit of an introduction about my approach to working with images in my practice in general. So as many artists, I prefer for the work to speak for itself, but it's always good to provide some context and rationale for the decisions I've made. So my attitude to images in general, I can explain in reference to an essay by W.J.T. Mitchell called Image. He describes our experience of an image as a double moment of appearing and recognition, the simultaneous noticing of a material object and an apparition, a form or a deformation. An image is always both there and not there, appearing in or on or as a material object, yet also ghostly, spectral, and evanescent. He goes on to note that an image is the uncanny content of a medium, the thing that makes its appearance in a medium, while making the medium itself appear as a medium. So for me, images are entangled with thingness. They are ubiquitous, inherently reflexive, and evasive. Images are not only representations or appearances, but also objects that contain surface, substance, and memory. In my work, the interpretation of images as objects is what drives the collection and integration of found visual materials. To contextualize precisely how I implement this in my work, I'll focus on how I integrate concepts of melancholy with processes of accumulation, fragmentation, distortion, and mimetic representation. Because I consider images to be objects, I should also define what my understanding of objects is philosophically. This understanding is partly influenced by one of object-oriented ontology's key concepts, the withdrawal of objects. Object-oriented ontology is a branch of philosophical field known as speculative realism, which addresses the limitations of our anthropocentric conceptions of human and non-human entities. Everything is considered to be equally real, and the aim is to observe and analyze the world without the hierarchies of privileging human experience over the existence of everything else. The idea of withdrawal in speculative realism is part of this kind of understanding of objects. Philosopher Graham Harman describes that when things withdraw from presence into their dark subterranean reality, when things withdraw from presence into their dark subterranean reality, they distance themselves not only from human beings, but from each other as well. The withdrawal of objects is also considered by thinkers outside of speculative realism. Giorgio Agamben, for example, has observed that things open to us the original place solely from which the experience of measurable external space becomes possible. Things are not properly anywhere because their place is found beyond the human in a zone that is no longer objective or subjective, neither personal nor impersonal, neither material nor immaterial. What interests me about this unnameable space of withdrawal is its intimate connection to the visualization of melancholy. Melancholy has been an ongoing theme in my practice for many years. For the melancholic gaze, vision folds and collapses into the disarticulated world of things. Objects seem to diffuse, turn dark and inaccessible, and this darkness is imposed on the subject, reducing perception itself to the withdrawn realm of objects. Author Peter Schranger explains that melancholy is generated by the act of perception, always falling short of full possession. The melancholic gaze is reflexive and scrupulous in its intent to perceive what resists perception, to falter where thought is reduced to one quality of many. The choice of melancholic imagery in my work comes from the image's formal fidelity to dissolution, incompleteness, and evasiveness with regard to both content and image qualities. So here you see an image of an earthquake that, it's a fragment from a book about natural catastrophes. So I replicated a fragment and placed it on top of the original image. The exhibition upstairs, 217, is called, as Finn was describing, 217 because it refers to a space in the fourth block of the nuclear Chernobyl power plant, and which contains a large radioactive mass of melted nuclear matter formed by the core meltdown in 1986. It's called the elephant's foot because of its shape and texture. The object and its surroundings could only be safely perceivable through images captured with a remotely controlled camera. The first attempt to photograph it with a camera on wheels was a failure because the camera was destroyed by the emissions from this object. And this is a floor plan of that space. Eventually, the object had to be photographed in a mirror with a camera around the corner. So I am interested in how this object is essentially invisible and how the images are acquired through distance and indirect reflection. The captured images are grainy and indistinct as alpha particles had interfered with the film and the space was dimly lit. The clarity of the images I sourced online is further distorted by their low resolution and digital artifacting. The elephant's foot appears in horrific obscurity, necessarily distant, directly imperceivable, and ultimately withdrawn. With this object in mind, withdrawal is more about obscurity and distance and distortion than it is about isolation. There is real presence and also interference. Philosopher Timothy Morton uses the elephant's foot as an example of our coexistence with immense objects that cannot be fully perceived. He remarks that objects emit zones. So, thinking about how the object emits a zone, these images are kind of like uncanny fragments cast from the enormity of the catastrophe in Chernobyl. They are lingering, melancholic after-images of a traumatic, historical, ecological, social, and political event. Ghostly, factual, but incomplete and lacking clarity. So my mode of working with this found imagery is partly influenced by an artist I greatly admire, V.S. Selmans. So my drawings recall V.S. Selmans' approach to using photographs as ready-made templates to meticulously redescribe. This redescription of photographs through the practice of drawing becomes a melancholic process through which the image is redistributed as a tangible yet withdrawn object. In a retrospective catalog of Selmans' work, Susan Hudson points to the melancholic connotations of her drawings when she observes that her all-over compositions appear to diffuse personhood into a million glinting flecks of a pencil and then leave you there alone with them. So for this body of work, I set out to redefine, through drawing, a group of 12 selected images from that report, using graphite on primed aluminum plates. And this was a means of isolating and studying these representations closely. It was important to work on aluminum plates floating an inch off the wall as a means of accentuating the tangibility and autonomy of the image. It was also important to build up a thick plaster-like coating of gesso in order to be able to work the surface in a way that is not possible when working on paper. This required a laborious process of applying between 10 and 12 coats of gesso with sanding between each coat. I had spent approximately 3 to 5 weeks on each drawing. Attempting to replicate the sourced images as close as possible. I was building up layers of graphite and subtracting from the gessoed surface by using fine-tipped erasers on sandpaper. There is a density of substance that had accumulated on and in the surface of the gesso through durations of mark making, corrections, and adjustments. I think the drawings are more tangible than their digital counterparts, but there's still a different level of impenetrability, as layers of graphite have created skins of darkness that are both light reflective and absorbent. Although there is depth to the surface, you are reminded that it is a surface. The drawings became screens for transcoding of photographic documents, methodically redescribing the visual information at hand. For me, this was a process of affirming the melancholic gaze through replication, to exercise fidelity to that which I know cannot be fully apprehended, and to assert the afterimage as an embodied withdrawn object. Another approach to the digital images gathered from this project involved the creation of 20 3D printed objects. They're titled Elephant's Foot Surface Studies. They are rendered from multiple sections of 3 of the sourced images. These sections are cropped close-ups of the surface of the elephant's foot. My objects are rendered solely from the data available in those sections. Using 3D rendering software called Blender, I imported the cropped sections of photographs as flat images. The form of each 3D rendering was then redefined by the extrusion of grayscale variations in the image. There were some minor adjustments that I had to make, but I tried to be as close to the original image as possible. I decided to make the objects in small scale, partly because of the costs associated with 3D printing, but also because there is no possible way for me to accurately determine and represent the real scale of these sections of surface. Through this process, the 3D printed objects are an attempt to materialize, though inaccurately and not to scale, a physical approximation of this enormously horrific and effectively invisible object. I wanted to create miniature, relatable models that allow a level of conceivable visualization of something that is almost inconceivable. While working on the drawings and the 3D prints, I had also produced drawings of radio-controlled robotic machines that were used for cleanup operations and investigations of the site in and around the 4th block. These machines are now defunct and many malfunctioned during operations due to high radiation levels in the area. My studies are based on found images of robots that are on display at a museum of robotic equipment near the site. I found the images through Google and their source is uncertain, but because they were on a blog, I got the sense that they were snapshots from someone's tourism venture to the area. This informal nature of the source photographs made sense for these drawings, which function more as incomplete sketches rather than detailed, condensed studies like those of the elephant's foot. These drawings serve as floating traces on a surface that itself implies fragility and decay. For these pieces, I had used found paper from 1990s Belarus, which for me is a material that is as integrated into the image object as the transcribed marks. I should mention that my specific interest in Soviet-era content and materials is inevitably influenced by my own experience of displacement from Belarus. However, what persists in my practice from this experience of loss and isolation is not a personal longing, but a kind of detached, speculative awareness for how images and materials documenting a particular historical and cultural moment now operate as withdrawn objects of semblance and residual familiarity. Content is flattened into surface, as well as the pathos latent in its inception. I work with a mix of intimate attention and distanced abstraction. My personal experience of Chernobyl did not directly influence my work, but it did come from the perception of this catastrophe as something invisible, yet always present and threatening. I was born in 1986, a few months after the core meltdown in Chernobyl. Growing up in Minsk, Belarus, I was aware that there were contaminated areas in other parts of the country, that people were ill. I was also aware that many people had dosimeters as part of their daily lives, my parents included. I did not understand how radiation functioned. Sometimes there were horrifying documentary programs on TV I did not fully understand. Danger and uncertainty were on my mind. I used to climb trees and smell the city dust and the foliage, wondering if some of the dust in the air is irradiated. My perception of the catastrophe was based on secondary information, always incomplete, always somewhere else. The source of fear was distant. So when I finally discovered images of the elephant's foot a few years ago, I thought, this is the source, the core, the center of the zone. This is what it looks like here in front of me, but on a computer screen. As close as I've ever gotten to understanding what had happened, and I do not understand. These images are uncanny and terrifying, perhaps more so because they are distanced through flatness and flawed representation. They induce a melancholy that is grounded in loss and verges on horror. So some of this relationship to images has translated into my later projects as well. The finding and fragmentation of historically saturated images and the use of found antiquated paper as a means to substantiate a kind of after-image. This had continued into my later and current projects dealing with Soviet-era imagery. The series of works following 217 were informed by an introverted acquired awareness of World War II as an indirect afterimage amassed for museums, fiction, and cinema. The exhibition was titled, "When People Came Out of the Forest, There Was Nothing." The drawings are based on selections of landscape backgrounds from found photographic documentation of World War II and near Belarus. Like my drawings of the elephant's foot, they are close studies of low-resolution black and white files translated into an accumulation of marks, surface, and atmosphere. The found images document instances of historical events, scenes of battles, death, and adversity in which landscape was not intended to be the focal point. The drawings fixate on a persistent impression of a mood more so than a tangible lived experience. These renditions resist complete comprehension, partly because the source images are sectioned into portions and enlarged. Furthermore, the found images are already distant and distorted through digitization and artifacted transcoding of original photographs that are sometimes blurry or blemished to begin with. The title, When People Came Out of the Forest, There Was Nothing, is derived from one of many first-hand accounts of World War II that was collected by an author, Svetlana Alexievich, in her book, The Unwomanly Face of War. In this collection of women's memories of World War II, landscape is frequently alluded to in accounts of traumatic and haunting experiences. The narratives include fragments of descriptions where earth, sky, forests, bogs, rivers, fields are inextricable from battle, displacement, devastation, and death. Land appeared to be a semblance of mood and trauma, of subjective experience that is inextricable from the substance of the environment. In A Field Guide to Melancholy, author Jackie Bowring describes that earth and water, and by extension landscape, are historically associated with melancholy. This relationship becomes more apparent when the visualization of melancholic landscape becomes entangled with mourning and the landscapes of collective memory, shaped by displacement through violence that induces loss, which can only be partially recalled. Memory is permeated with gaps and fractures. This loss implicit in memory becomes a withdrawn object of melancholic visualization, and recollections are seen not as not a direct recording and unreeling of experience, but rather as reconstructed, condensed representations that remembering and forgetting shape in equal measure. The act of working with collected and archived digital images that I use in my practice, as well as the reproduction of those images, it's my means of isolating and restructuring traces of subjective experience available in the formation of cultural memory at large. Reclaimed representations of cultural memory are remediated as authentic, self-contained objects, even if they are acquired as flawed, indistinct, or distorted. So this piece here is part of the current ongoing project, which is more focused specifically on the melancholy of nostalgia. Separation from closure is part of what motivates nostalgia, and it is maintained through collection, remediation, and circulation of cultural traces and objects. Because post-Soviet nostalgia in particular invokes the vastness and atmosphere of generated ideologically habituated culture, it is rarely fixated on singular objects. So unlike my previous works, then I am trying to find that I need to find a direction of forming constellations and juxtapositions of remnants, rather than focusing on isolated studies of samples. The overarching title of my current project, Obraz, Abrez, Ostatak, translates from Russian as image or appearance, edge or slice, and remnant. The project reiterates fragments of appropriated images in combination with collected objects. Initially, this consisted of a series of watercolor studies on Soviet-era notebook paper titled Objects in Soviet Films. The images are derived from isolated sections of film stills showing background objects seen in Soviet films of the 1970s and 80s. They were accessed through YouTube, and the films are poor in image quality, which is emphasized by the blurriness of the extreme details of the fictionalized domestic scenes. The indistinctness of the objects is reiterated through dense accumulation of watercolor paint. Through this process, it becomes difficult to discern between the authenticity of real domestic spaces and the contrived set designs that are meant to evoke authenticity. The objects are flattened, and cultural reference to Soviet imagination are sliced and folded into small, vaguely familiar sections of shapes and colors. There is also commonality to the distant mood of the depicted blurry objects, which for me can be expressed by the Russian word toska. It's a word that refers to a kind of melancholy that is situated in apprehension, nostalgia, and ennui. These works led to a video piece titled Incidental Television in Soviet Films, which is a video loop montaged from found footage of televisions observed in Soviet films. I don't know if maybe later we'll have time to show this film, but these are just some stills from the video. An audio track consists of appropriated USSR promotional voiceovers for TV models, and it's mixed with sounds of domestic background noise also appropriated from Soviet films. The collected moving images are cropped from the full frame of the film and enlarged to isolate the televisions as objects of attention. Some images are out of focus, they appear faint or simply artifacted through entropy of lossy data compression. The content of the moving images emitted from the televisions staged as background scenery in films is kind of arbitrary and just happens to be what it is. The clips are overlapping, fleeting, morphing fragments of information that is both present and real and temporally withdrawn. The shifting frame of the television flows through mixed iterations of itself, never quite in focus, always referring to an ambiguous past. In addition to collecting film stills, my current project involves purchasing Soviet items for reuse and recontextualization. So here I have been tracing marks, stamps, or signatures made in Soviet instruction manuals. And the thin material, it also comes from the USSR. This piece is titled History of the Communist Party of the USSR, and it consists of a found book of the same title and a watercolor study on Soviet-era paper based on a film still of a burning USSR history textbook from a 1990 film. And that's a close-up. December 28th, 1991 is a similar kind of assemblage of found culturally specific, outdated material, combined with a painted study of a specific section of visual ephemera. Both of these works are constructed around reflexivity, one depicting the symbolic destruction of USSR history emerging from an actual obsolete USSR history book, the other reflecting a partially concealed newspaper image that is mimetically expanded as a refraction to the reflective surface. So for me, painting here is utilized as an after-image, contriving scrupulous familiarity with specific pieces of historical debris. As assembled combinations, the works are both self-negating and self-representational. affirming themselves as mere appearances or diffused cultural matter. So to tie all these works together, from the exhibition currently in the gallery to the pieces I'm working on now, I would like to come back to where I started with the notion of images as objects and the melancholy and the withdrawal of objects. There is an excess in images that is not accessible to subjective perception. In my work, I attempt to imply the presence of this excess, and while I engage in close study and mimesis of the image's appearance as an after-image of what appears to be accessible on the surface, it is a strategy of reflexivity to imply the inaccessible. So, to conclude, it is melancholy's fixation on the blind spot of withdrawal that continues to compel the intimate reconstruction of images in my practice. So that's a little poetic ending, and thank you for your attention.